Chapter 13. Sunday late afternoon. Now that Doreen was alone again, and her house empty of unwanted persons, she couldn't rest until she did a thorough check through everything. She should have had Mac check the whole house. What if somebody had come out from one entrance while she and Mac were at the other? After a quick search, starting upstairs and working her way downstairs, Doreen noted that her animals seemed unperturbed. Feeling better, Doreen locked up the external doors again, along with the unsecured garage door now jammed tight, the big external garage door shut and locked, the internal kitchen door shut and locked, and with a kitchen chair jammed under its knob, and she then set the security. She stood in the middle of the living room and brushed her hands together. "There," she said, "that should fix it." By now it was nearing dinner time. She was tired and fed up, and oddly pissed off that somebody else was trying to steal her antiques. She had to get through today on her own, guarding her pricey collections, and then tomorrow she'd be fine, once Scott got here in the morning. The moving guys would be here again for those big-ticket items. But she really needed somebody to sell these little items. On that note, she walked over to her laptop, turned it on, and sent a note asking if Scott could remember to send her the names of other experts she could contact. Not expecting to hear from him anytime soon, she sat down and browsed the internet looking for local shops. Mostly boutique clothing stores popped up. Places that she would have normally loved, but considering boutiques were almost always more expensive. She didn't need any clothes. She still had a massive stack in the spare room to sort through. When her stomach rumbled, she stood, looked in the fridge, and frowned. Deciding to be good, she made a salad and opened a can of tuna, mixed it with mayonnaise, and dabbed it around the top of her lettuce. For an added touch, she then took a dill pickle, chopped it up, and added it to the center. Taking her plate outside, she sat in the waning sun, watching the backyard with all her animals around her. It was just so peaceful and relaxing when she could see the water at the edge of her property gently flowing toward the lake, with the late afternoon sunlight dappling across the ripples. The sun at this particular height and strength made all the green grass look so much brighter, all the yellows so much more golden. As soon as she finished her salad, she made a cup of tea, and then walked with her critters down to the creek. She considered the area and really wanted a bench so she could sit here and enjoy the view. In lieu of a bench, she chose a couple rocks along the water's edge. Slipping off her sandals, she sat down, letting her feet rest in the water. It was still early in the year. She wasn't sure when the spring runoff would happen. So far, the water just trickled by, although as she looked around, she frowned because several of the rocks that she used to be able to see were now underwater. So the water was rising. Had it been rising steadily, and she just hadn't seen it happen? All too possible. She had been a little busy. Sometimes spring came very early and sometimes late. There just didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. But then maybe global climate change was having an effect here. She imagined living along the river would be different each and every year, because Mother Nature never did anything exactly the same. There was a bit of a slope from the edge of her property, down maybe 1.5 feet or so. As she stopped and really looked at it though, she found it was a good 2 feet. And this little backyard garden sloped up toward the house, so that was probably another 1 or 2 feet. How high did the water rise at this area? The creek itself wasn't terribly wide here, so it would probably come through pretty fast and sharp. Maybe that was why the old back fence had been beaten up. Maybe the spring runoff hit it year after year, and the battering over time just made it all go to pieces. It wasn't her current issue, but she sat here and found the water level high enough now that the ducks could swim past her place. She sat entranced as a mallard pair went by, followed by several golden eyes. She couldn't believe how beautiful they were and how completely uncaring Muggs was, sitting here beside her. She put a hand on his neck in warning. "We leave all of Mother Nature alone," she said in a firm voice. But true to Muggs, he turned and looked at her and raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Who are you kidding?" He had been instrumental in dealing with intruders and people attacking her, so she amended her warning to say, "We leave all of Mother Nature's animals alone, except for the nasty two-legged ones." He sagged down so he lay stretched out, but he was ever alert while he watched the antics of the ducks as they dabbled along the far edge of the creek. Goliath was the one that worried her now. He sat on a rock staring at the ducks, his body in a pounce position, the ruff of his neck alert, and he made weird little sounds in the back of his throat while his tail twitched hard. "Goliath," she said in a stern voice. "That's a no." His tail just flicked at her once really hard as if to say, "Yeah? And who'll stop me?" She studied the distance between the ducks and Goliath and noted that unless he got over his disgust of water, the ducks would be perfectly safe. And of course Thaddeus, not to be outdone, sat on a rock beside Goliath, calling out, "Good afternoon, Thaddeus here. Good afternoon, Thaddeus here." She chuckled. "I don't think they can talk back like you talk," she said, laughing at the bird's antics. She picked up her phone and put it on video. "Say hello again, Thaddeus," she cried out. Thaddeus looked at her and snapped his beak shut. "Why do you insist on being perverse?" she asked in exasperation. "You know how perfect it would be to see you introducing yourself to the ducks." "Maybe they didn't hear you the first time," she tried again. He cocked his head, looking at her as if she was full of it. And of course, she was talking to the dratted bird as if he were a child. Still, he acted that way a lot of the time, so maybe she wasn't so far off. The ducks finally paddled their way farther up the creek, leaving her without any other wildlife to enjoy. She shifted position until she could lean back against another rock and closed her eyes, her face up against the setting sun. She could hear the birds above the beautiful willow on the other bank. She sat here enthralled. "Good thing I didn't bring that loser of a husband here," she murmured. "He'd never appreciate such simple joys as this." "Good thing, isn't it?" a familiar voice asked. Startled, she turned to look at Steve, Penny's lawyer friend. He glared at her. And suddenly she realized just how exposed she felt. Vulnerable, even. "You got a problem?" she asked defiantly. Where did she learn a good defense was a strong offense? Because really that would be a bad idea here. Muggs growled as he turned his attention to the approaching stranger. "It's okay, Muggs," she whispered. And she hoped it was. But she couldn't guarantee it. Steve looked at her with one of those "I hate what you've done to my life" looks. "Sorry you've lost your friend." She spoke calmly but kept him in her sights. "If Penny hadn't tried to kill me, she would have had one less criminal act to worry about." "You're the only one who says she tried to kill you," he scoffed. "She told me that she did no such thing, and you fabricated the entire lie." She stared at him. "I still have stitches in my head," she said indignantly. "She hit me over the head with a pry bar, for crying out loud." He just shrugged and said, that injury needing stitches could have come from anywhere. "I wasn't alone. There was a witness," she said. "Or have you forgotten that?" "Penny said he arrived after the fact, and you're the one who told him what she'd done." She was a little worried Penny could turn Doreen's story around that way, but she shook her head and said, "No, that's not true. But then I'm not going to sit here and argue with you regarding something you know nothing about, which you didn't witness yourself. Obviously you care very deeply for her, and again I'm sorry for your loss." Then she stood, knowing she should probably leave well enough alone. But unable to do that, she said, "On the other hand, maybe you should be thanking me." He stared at her. "Well, you've got to be thinking how every male around Penny was murdered," she said quietly. "Or at least died under suspicious circumstances." His face darkened, and he took a threatening step toward her. Immediately Muggs placed himself in front of her and growled. Steve looked at the dog in disgust. "If you think that little upstart will stop me when I really feel like going after you," he said, "you can think again." "So that's a threat, is it?" she asked, remembering her phone was still on video in her hand. She tilted her cell phone screen to show it to him. Would you care to repeat that? I don't have to repeat anything, he said. You'll get yours. I promise. He turned around on his heels and walked away. She held up her phone, making sure she got a good picture of him as he left. Then she squatted, her hands shaky, her stomach queasy as she cuddled Muggs. Thank you, big guy. He might have dissed you, but I do believe he didn't want to take you on. Goliath wove between her legs to come up between her and Muggs, looking for ear scratches. As Doreen looked around to see where Thaddeus was, he waddled after Steve, the guy who just threatened her. Thaddeus, come back here, she called out. Thaddeus turned, looked at her, and cocked his head. She patted her knee as if he were a dog. Come on. Let's go back inside and get treats. At that, Thaddeus lifted his wings and half ran, half hopped toward her in a weird flightless movement. She bent down, scooped him up, and put him on her shoulder. As she straightened, Steve had disappeared from sight. That was oddly even more disquieting. Back in the house, she reset the security and sat down in the living room, just to relax a bit, but, feeling restless, she decided to grab a bottle of water and move the animals upstairs, and then realized she'd forgotten to give them their treats. She raced back down, grabbed the treats, and then gave them to the animals in her bedroom. She looked at the room and groaned. There's still so much stuff. Nan, why? But with still an hour until her normal bedtime, she had time to do more. She had stacks of clothing on the floor which she sorted through, laughing when she realized the entire stack could go to Wendy. She likely needed another box and another bag, considering the number of shoes and belts and scarves. They just weren't her style. Some were very Western looking, some were full of rhinestones, some were beaded things that she didn't understand. She stuffed a lot of the items in the one empty box in her bedroom. She went down to the kitchen, grabbed a large garbage bag, brought it back up and filled it completely. Groaning, she headed back downstairs, grabbed a second one, came back up, and had it full soon too. But at least that stack on the floor was gone. As far as she was concerned, that was enough for the night. The animals agreed because they sat on her bed, already half asleep, and she remembered she had still not found anything for Thaddeus to sleep on. Darn, she said. Noting the hook in the ceiling for draping a hanging lamp, she wasn't sure just what she could do, but she had a really big rectangular scarf hanger. Nan loved her scarves apparently, about 4 feet long, with one bigger round section at the bottom where Thaddeus could perch. That might work. Climbing on a sturdy chair, she hung it from the hook on the ceiling. When she jumped back down, she studied her new roost for Thaddeus. The biggest ring was really thin and would be hard on his claws. He'd have to hold on really tight. Not sure he could even do that. So she grabbed a couple of the scarves and wrapped them around the biggest ring, turning it into a padded perch. Now he had something bigger to hold on to, and it was soft enough to not hurt him. And the best part was, she could reach him on it without a chair. Thaddeus had watched her curiously as she started and finished this project. When she scooped him up and placed him on it, he squawked several times and then moved around a little bit from side to side as if assessing the best place to sit. Then he lowered himself and perched. She looked at him and smiled. I know it's not quite big enough, she said apologetically. And it's definitely rustic looking, but I promise we'll find something else for you soon. She gently stroked his cheeks. He pushed his head in as he cuddled her fingers. She got on her tiptoes to kiss him gently. As she stepped away, he pooped onto her floor. Forgot the dang newspaper. Such was her life.